But let's go back to Genesis 13. And I want to take you to a second point. Number one, they're God's chosen people. That's repeated from Genesis through Deuteronomy. But let me show you, number two, God promised not only that they were His chosen people, but God promised to give a land to them. Now, if you look at chapter 12 for just a second. I want you to see verse 1. Leave your country, your people, and household, and go to a land. Okay? If that wasn't important, God would just have dropped it. But look at chapter 13, verse 15. And we'll just walk through the land with Abraham. Chapter 13 of Genesis, verse 15. And what the Lord says is, all the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. Verse 15. Forever. Now, just think for a minute. What do you know about God? Does God exaggerate? Does God make mistakes? Does God say things He doesn't mean? God said to a man standing in the dirt, the dust, the sands of the Middle East, He says, to you and to your descendants, to your seed, to those you beget, I will give this land, look at the last word of verse 15, forever. The devil heard that, and he's read it, and he doesn't like that. That God, as it were, put a stake down. He planted a flag in a spot. Keep going to chapter 15. Look at verse 7. God repeats this so many times to Abraham. Abraham really began to believe it. And He said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, Genesis 15:7, to give you this land, to take possession of it. He says, I, in chapter 12, verse 1, promised you a land. In chapter 13, I said it was yours forever. In chapter 15, verse 7, I want you to take possession of it. I want you to realize I promised this for you, and it is for you. Look at chapter 15, verse 18. 15:18. On that day the Lord made a covenant. This is that one I told you about, the blood path. And made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. Now, you always hear the world talking politically. You know what they talk about? They talk about the West Bank. You know what prophetic writers joke about? The West Bank of which river? Because what did God give them? He gave them, look back at this 18th verse, from the river Egypt to the great river Euphrates. I mean, we're talking about a far bigger land than Israel has possessed since the time of David and the expansion of the kingdom in Solomon's time. They've just gone back from that ever since. And what was it, verse 19, to specify the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, verse 20, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, verse 21, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Those were the nations of Canaan that God displaced to put His people in 4,000 years ago. God promised this to Abraham. Look at chapter 26, because He keeps talking and promising. And in chapter 26, He repeats His promises to Isaac. And He says to Isaac, verse 3, stay in this land. This is the son of promise. Remember, there were two sons of Abraham. Ishmael, the son of Abraham's lack of faith and disobedience. He goes down and gets Hagar in Egypt and starts the whole situation with Ishmael. And then there's the son of promise, Isaac. And so God reveals Himself to Isaac and says, stay in this land, verse 3 of chapter 26, for a while, and I will be with you and bless you. For you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. So God wasn't done. He just keeps repeating this to Abraham's son. And verse 4, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all these lands. And through your offspring, all the nations on the earth will be blessed. There's that repetition of that Genesis 12 promise, that great avenue of blessing to all the people groups. And by the way, Genesis 10 records the 70 nations, the 70 people groups of earth. And if you read the table of nations in Genesis 10, you can find those nations in all the royal archives of Europe. the European records go right back to Genesis 10's Table of Nations. And all of the European communities, and if you look far enough, you can even find this in the other people groups around the world, back to those nations. But he said, the repetition, and keep reading in 26, verse 5, because Abraham obeyed me, kept my requirements, my commands and decrees and my laws. And that was his faith. Remember, all this is predicated on God's grace and Abraham's faith. Now look at chapter 28, because God repeats the promise to Jacob. And in 28:13, it's this whole Bethel ladder going to heaven and the angels going up and down scene when Jacob is on his way to Haran and back to the land of his forefathers. And he says in Genesis 28:13, there above it stood the Lord and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Wow. And your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. Verse 14, you shall spread abroad the west and the east and the north and the south, and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. There's that repetition of the promise to Abraham in chapter 12. And God says that. And if you keep going to Joshua 14, we could read these, but I wanted to show you that after the conquest, look at Joshua, go Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, chapter 14. Look what God says in verse 9, as God is reiterating his plan. He says in verse 9, so Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land where your foot has trodden shall be your inheritance and your children's forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. You notice God promised through Moses, he repeats the promise, that it would be their inheritance and that of their children, the inheritance of their children forever.